Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, good people. Welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola sitting in the host chair this time. Everybody's laughing right now because I strategically make sure that I never actually open the episode just so they throw to me so I can do that catchphrase. I don't think people know that yet. Now everybody does. I am joined today by Evan Buck. Evan Buck, you want to say hello?
Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
Robert Koshu.
Hello, everybody.
And Dylan Hosmer, who has openly declared he hates me in the discussion of this, so that's fun.
I couldn't resist making him start the episode, so I didn't have to wait on pins and needles to find out whether he was going to interrupt me in an intro.
The fact is, I might even just include the dead air at the beginning of this, just for the weight for that, because I was trying to work that in sometimes. I don't know.
You all get an insight into the wonderfully dysfunctional A Fork in Time family.
So this is the third iteration of our Sanjurjo episode. We did sit down and promised we made a promise to ourselves that we're actually going to talk about Spain.
Well, I was going to say we figured out a way how to actually include Sanjurjo in our discussion.
In our Sanjurjo fork. But I just wanted to kind of open I did what I do and I kind of blew up the last episode of this fork, so want to kind of set the stage again for where we are at this point. The fork was in July of 1936 when Sanjurjo was basically leading the nationalist coup that turned into Spanish Civil War. And this was before TSA. This was before checking of bags. And he tried to fly with too many uniforms because, he did not know what kind of occasions he would have to run into cooing a country. And it led to a plane crash. It killed him. From there, basically, in our timeline, he survives. He takes over kind of the Carlist wing and leads the nationalists to be much closer to Italy than to Germany. What that results in is basically there is no kind of Italian-German pre-war working together to support the nationalists. And what you had is the Italians backing their preferred flavor of fascism in Austria, I guess, preventing the Anschluss with Germany. So what that leads to, basically Italy backs Austria, and Hitler in Germany looks at this and says, you know what? I don't want to start with fighting a big war. So let me turn my attention somewhere else. Let me pick off somewhere else. And he does that in Poland. Now, in our timeline, we always envision the invasion of Poland as the beginning of the war. The thing is, the invasion of Poland in our timeline was at the end of a long series of German territorial acquisitions. In this timeline, it's not. In this timeline, this is kind of the first step one of the first steps that Germany takes. What that means is Britain and France haven't spent basically 3 to 4 years watching Germany take over places and haven't built up to the point where they realize Germany is a major threat. So that means that in this alternate timeline, Germany makes a deal with the Soviet Union, very similar to our Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but Poland doesn't have guarantees of its independence by Britain and France. So when the Soviet Union and Germany go into Poland, Britain and France sit on the sidelines because they don't necessarily have any commitments to Poland. From there, we envisioned if Germany and the Soviet Union border each other and Germany's not busy somewhere else, that's going to lead to a war at some point. What we envisioned was the Soviet Union basically trying to grab Romania, part of Romania, Bessarabia, Germany backing them, and that leads to the beginning of basically the Great Patriotic War. For a term, in kind of spring 1940, Germany wins that because they're not busy anywhere else. One of the things that happens, though, once Germany kind of kicks in the door, Japan out in far eastern Soviet Union starts gobbling up stuff as well. And the Soviet Union collapses. You had, I think, just in our minds, it was kind of everything west of the Urals is basically German controlled, as well as down into the Caucasus. And the Japanese probably have up to Lake Baikal. There is kind of a Russian military dictatorship somewhere in central Russia, but they have no power. They have no industry. It's just because nobody really wants that.
It's basically a Siberian rump state that nobody really even wants to bother to conquer.
Exactly. And
It's
thank
a
you.
bunch of serfs and Cossacks.
Thank you, Evan, because I just wanted to make sure that everybody else's mics were working for a second there. Ooh, I can breathe. All right. The other thing we talked about was the Shah of Iran basically once Germany takes over the Caucasus and Baku, very critical there. They have oil. They are also, because they have so much oil, they're also sending, maybe not that much, but enough so that it's not an issue to Japan, so that Japan's not worried about trying to get oil from anywhere else. Germany begins forming an alliance with the Shah of Iran, a man who basically started his career as a cavalry officer. He is not a royal.
But by the way, this is not the modern Shah. This is that guy's father.
It's his
The first
father.
Shah.
Was
Correct.
Who,
that
let's
guy's
note,
father.
yeah, let's note in our timeline, he had to abdicate the throne as the result of the, Anglo-Soviet invasion of 41.
Mhm.
As we'll be getting into later on in this episode, that does not happen. So this Shah probably sticks around until his death in 1944, I would say.
You can't have an Anglo-Soviet invasion if you don't have any Soviets.
If there are no Soviets.
So I think that's gets us up to a good point, recaps the previous two episodes.
Mhm.
I think where we are going now is this. As I was kind of talking about, Reza Shah Pahlavi started his career as a cavalry officer. He actually mounted a coup, I want to say 1924, against the previous regime, and founded the Pahlavi dynasty. And the reason I'm talking about that is this. If he is supported by Germany, he's probably very interested in kind of attaching his name to very big and important, and basically like creating a new empire to solidify his legitimacy. The other thing to think about is you always hear, and we talked a little bit on the last episode, you hear Hitler always compared to Napoleon. They can't stop. Conquering is what they do. And even when they reach natural borders, where it would make a lot of sense to stop and consolidate, he won't. So,
And I mean, I think that's partly because of the governing ideology.
Mhm.
Like you always, in order to have that system thrive, you always have to have an enemy, whether it's
Mhm.
external or internal. You always have to rely upon the,
Yep.
the dispossessing of somebody.
something.
Mhm.
So at this point, there's nobody else other than the traditional kind of old Western powers. The more so, I'll call them the colonial powers. And I think
We're talking
to
the
kind of
Netherlands, France, England at this point.
France and England,
Yeah.
the Netherlands,
And they got a little bit here and there.
they
But
do have some stuff. They mattered a lot more when their stuff was actually up for grabs. What I'm thinking about is kind of a mindset of this. Thinking about Germany after the First World War and the idea that, hey, what they, the Western powers, the Entente, did to us was they strangled us. They used their colonies to encircle and strangle us. Well, this time, I'm going to take their colonies from them. That's where I'm going to fight this war from the German perspective. And the idea that basically plays into the French strategy. The French and British assume that immediately, as soon as the war begins, the fighting will be on the Rhine. The fighting will be in Alsace-Lorraine and in the Maginot Line in Western Europe. But what if it's not? Because that's where they put everything.
And Hitler is smart enough and has enough at this point, even if he just grabs some Russian conscripts he sits a division-sized force or army-sized force, corps, in our term probably be a better way to look at it, on the Rhine, just sitting there, doing maneuvers, doing things, and he may be using the conscripts from Russia just to sit there and do whatever, because if you do that, we can't leave. Got to leave these troops because if they come over, we're done. So let's sit still.
Makes a lot of sense.
And what we discussed and envisioned was this: the combination of the Iranian imperial ambitions and German imperial ambitions come together. At this point, it's about 1944. Germany has digested what it's taken from the Soviet Union, and you have a coup. We talked about this, we talked about in our timeline, there was a pan-Arabist coup in August 1941 against the British Mandate government, the British supported government in Iraq, in Mesopotamia. It was supported by both the Italians and the Germans in our timeline. In this timeline, they put them off a little bit. You had Ayman al-Husseini, who we talked a little bit, who had already led the Arab revolt against the British in the Mandate of Palestine in 1936. And at this point, he's hanging out in Berlin, and I think the Germans tell him to sit around. And just to establish a hard date, let's say August of 44, push it forward 3 years, the Germans support a coup amongst military officers in Baghdad of the mandatory army. For those of you, that sit there and watch history channel documentaries, Saddam's family is actually involved in this. So that attempt to overthrow and take over the British mandate in Iraq is what starts the fight with the West. Does that make sense to everybody else? And
Yep.
let's take it from there.
I think that makes sense. I do think that something, just to clarify what we discussed in the pre-podcast, just to make sure we have all the pieces in play, was that kind of starts off. I think that's, I would say, the first domino that falls, because if I remember correctly, when we discussed in the pre-podcast, what really gets the actual war going is when Iran attempts to take the southern area of Iraq, which is, religiously much more aligned with the Iranian regime. For those who aren't familiar, there's the two main branches of Islam, the Sunnis and the Shiites. Iraq, most of the northern area of Iraq, Baghdad, all of those areas are Sunnis, and the Shiites are mainly in the south. And so that's why you hear a lot, probably in the news, if you super still keep up with this kind of thing in the Middle East, of how Iran has these like Shiite backed militias that are going on still in Iraq. That's because there is that, there's that animosity between those two countries, and it's the Iran-Iraq war, all this stuff. That is all basically mainly because of thousands of years of religious history, religious conflict. And so in this timeline, if I'm understanding correctly, we are saying that Iran is going to want to, they're looking at southern Iraq and they're like, hey, looks like free real estate, if I understand things correctly.
So what kind of the way where my mind was is the coup is meant to overthrow the British. It's meant to get the British out of Mesopotamia, and Iraq. Basically, again, I flip back between these two things, and the reason I think this is really important is this: Iraq is Iraq can't drink. Is the best way to put this as a country. It is a very new conception as a political entity, and in our time, in our minds nowadays, Iraq's a country, and internally there's a lot of divisions between it. At this point, nobody thinks they are Iraqi. There is no conception of it as a nation. Like, everybody there looks at this government and is like, oh, those are the British. They call us whatever. And I think the idea behind the coup is this: we're gonna disrupt some stuff, and we're gonna see what happens. If the British let this go, then we're gonna dispose it as we see necessary. If the British decide to fight, then we'll fight. No matter what the promise is, basically, you allow in our troops, Iran, you'll get the South. How the mechanism for how you get the South is a little nebulous.
Where Iran gets the South, and they get that as part of the deal. The deal is we'll help you funnel Iran. I think Iran. I think the Shah funnels money and other things over, money and weapons, in exchange for the Basra region, because then he
allows in German troops.
Yep.
Because the Iraqis then get rid of the troublesome population that they don't want to deal with.
Well, again, keeping this in mind, like we talk about. I'm trying not to use the word Iraqi.
Yeah.
Because the people mounting this coup, nobody sees themselves. Nobody is Iraqi.
They're pan-Arabists. They don't really have this sense of national Iraqi identity. They're just wanting to kick, colonial powers out, which is also very congruous with the stated intentions of the Iranians.
Yeah.
It's the flavor of people who are trying to do it that they're not super fond of.
And basically, but this, both of them hate the British and the French, and I think the
enemy of my enemy is my friend.
The coup plotters, want to kind of take Baghdad and rebuild kind of Saladin's empire. Take Damascus, take the Mandate of Palestine.
Well, on a macro level, this, the minute workings of exactly how this ends up happening don't from a geostrategic global scale, don't matter quite as much to the people who aren't directly on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But what that does is, especially from the British perspective, if you lose Mesopotamia and Baghdad, you have now lost your not most developed, but your most convenient route to what has been the jewel of the empire.
Yeah, strategically,
for 200 years.
it's a huge loss.
Because now the British can't go through the Persian Gulf.
No Persian Gulf.
Directly to India.
Yep.
They have to go through the Suez and around Arabia, which is huge when like 40% of the British economy or something crazy like that is either directly or independently or indirectly dependent on stuff that they get from India.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a huge destabilizing factor. And especially if Iran turns around and once they get Baghdad, they say, hey, we have all these aspirations of sort of Indo-Aryanism, sort of the old vestiges of the Timurid Empire, the Persian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, all these old great ancient empires. Where did a lot of those come from? The eastern end.
Yep.
So it's entirely believable that especially once they can get Baghdad and Mesopotamia and the British are not necessarily destabilized, but they're thrown off their center of balance. Like the first punch in a boxing match, they're on the back foot. The Persians may decide to go after India, which has always kind of been a problem for the British to keep a lid on ever since the days that the East India Company was ravaging the countryside.
And as we mentioned in the pre-discussion, also in the second podcast episode, why was Iran renamed Iran? Because literally it translates to land of the Aryans. And what we also discussed in the pre-podcast was where are the old, Aryan empires founded? And Dylan was like, okay, the real one, the fake one, or the other 5 fake ones, because there's a lot of people claiming
because a lot of this is like post World War II archaeology and stuff that we figured out. But at the time, it was at least it was known kind of as a thing.
Yeah, so the I would call the historical, ancient, actual, literal, part of Hitler's inspiration for his ideology was in India.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So to us, that makes for a very clean, clear segue for the igniting of tensions.
Well, and this
is what brings the West into the conflict.
Yeah, and there is a significant Muslim population in what in this timeline is still the British Raj of India.
Because
Pakistan.
Pakistan doesn't exist. Pakistan is still part of India.
Yeah, Pakistan and India exist.
Not only does Pakistan, not only is it, when we talk about the dominion of India, it does that include Pakistan. The other part of it is to consider is this: the Muslim population. There is still a large Muslim population in India, but at this time it's even larger because during the partition, basically in our timeline in 47, which hasn't happened yet, when the British pull out and literally walk away and put no thought whatsoever into how this is going to wind up, who's going to be on what side of what line.
Oh, they literally walked out.
Almost like colonial powers have no real idea of the consequences of the lines that they draw. Who would have thought?
Yeah, on both sides of this, you had a massive exchange of populations is probably one of the better ways to put this, because all of a sudden you had this line show up and you had a bunch of Hindus in what was about to become a Muslim state, and you had a bunch of Muslims at what was about to become, I'm going to say, India, a Hindu-dominated state. And there are just masses of people going, flowing back and forth over this. And you don't have that here. So that Muslim population extends much further into British India.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, and just, like I said at the beginning, just sheer economic impact, because the Brits are still so dependent on especially like, raw materials, cotton, textiles, tea. Let's not forget the whole British Empire runs on tea. Just from a sheer economic standpoint, much less kind of, cultural and political perspectives, the British have to hold on to India. So they're immediately going to go all eyes like on a swivel straight to the Middle East, along with the French.
As soon as they realize it's seriously under threat.
It's under threat.
But here's my question, or what I find, an interesting thought, right? So the British planning and let's call it the Western planning, the British and French planning assumes a German invasion in Western Europe.
Yeah.
And their war book, when war is declared, we ship the BEF to northern France, wait there, and get ready. Same with the French. The question is this: assuming what we all, let's playing this through, the coup is successful, Britain decides to fight, you have troops invading into kind of India again. Hey, into Dominion of India, what is today Pakistan, into the Levant. How quickly are they able to turn their head? That's a real question I have. How quickly are they able to turn their head? And are they able to turn their head in time to use the canal? Or have they lost the canal because they expected the wrong direction?
Well, I don't know if they've straight up lost the canal, just because I don't, the British have.
By the canal, are we talking about
Suez?
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say, because I remember in the pre-podcast planning, we were talking about,
Panama.
possible Panama. That's attraction.
But at least
I just wanted to make sure I was in the right hemisphere, making sure we're on the right path. We talked about a possible invasion of Egypt as well, but that's again something that can happen later.
Basically, at this point, like I kind of get what you're saying, which is if they can get to kind of Haifa, they can threaten and like create enough havoc in the shipping lanes that have to go through the Eastern Mediterranean that they might as well be on the Suez.
Yeah, and I think probably, and this is also dependent on what the Germans decide to do. If they know the Iranians are planning this, they might.
Oh, the Iranians and Germans are working together.
So the Germans 100%. Very well might have U-boats parked in the channel and around, certain parts of the UK, waiting for the declarations to officially happen so that they can start, not necessarily fully choking, but obstructing any attempts at troop movement.
I actually think they have those in like Sevastopol.
Oh, okay.
Because if you look at, I know this sounds weird, even in our timeline, if you look at like you would look at this and say, hey, the channel's right there. Why? Well, thinking about this, your suggestion of pre-placing why didn't they do that in September of 39?
Yeah,
the channel is not U-boat country.
Yeah.
It's too shallow.
You need space. Yeah.
It's way too shallow.
Yeah.
But if you send them to Sevastopol or into that area, once you take Haifa, once you take Beirut, then you can base there and just mess up the shipping lanes.
You can obliterate.
But I see the British, probably all of their direct forces shuttling immediately to North Africa just to get to the Suez however they can. Because let's not forget, the Italians
stop them from actually losing the Suez.
And all the colonial troops, like I'm picturing South African troops, and maybe some Australian troops probably being the first people to try and get to India.
Which this makes sense because, again, considering what we set up in episode 2, Japan doesn't have to turn south. Australia's not being threatened, and this is much more focused like in a Middle Eastern conflict and Indian subcontinent conflict. So that makes a lot of sense.
This is Rommel going to town.
Yeah. Well, and it's also from the British perspective, they don't have to fight across North Africa. The Italians are at least neutral. They may not be friendly, but they're neutral.
Yeah.
So the Brits Italians can kind of skip over Libya.
Yeah. And the Italians have enough misgivings about, about Hitler and Germany and all of that. And, as we said in the pre-podcast, Mussolini and Hitler just did not like each other on a personal level. But I don't believe that is going to be cause enough for the Italians to want to tick off the Germans or get involved.
Yeah.
But they're certainly not going to be in favor of, what the ultimate ambitions of Germany are here.
Yeah.
The Italians are doing what they did in our timeline between the beginning of the Polish War and 2 weeks before the fall of France.
They're getting ready to hit the change teams button.
They're
realizing their Roman ambitions at least as best they can.
They are waiting to see what they can get.
Yeah.
They're looking for an opportunity.
Which probably, I think, since we're talking about the Italians, probably they're, because they've had more time to solidify, several extra years of buildup and economic progression. They're probably looking at kind of the Balkans and sort of the ancient, quote unquote, Hellenic sort of.
Yeah. They're wanting to run. They're running into that area.
Yeah. So Mussolini's looking at like classic Illyria, what's now Yugoslavia and especially Croatia, trying to see what he can do there.
I'm having mental images of our Crassus episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In that what he is building is a Roman style empire in that area. We talked about Metaxas as a Greek dictator that, if you get rid, Metaxas in Greece, we talked about the Ustase regime in Croatia as people that Italy would do business with and would be very happy.
We got the Roman client state system
exactly
2.0 electric boogaloo.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that when the Italians are doing this, especially in Greece, the British are probably not super happy, but the Italians have a very important spot on the African Horn that the British have to be able to get through if they're going to get troops to India with any kind of speed.
And I think what happens, maybe the Italians use the opportunity of this outbreak of the war to gobble up Yugoslavia and to do what they want there, with the idea that Britain is going to let us do it because they don't want to.
Yeah. The Brits got bigger fish to fry. The Germans got bigger fish to fry. Italians are able to, not with impunity, but they're able to basically get a lot of their, I used to say, geopolitical stratagems, ambitions the way they want.
They are operating from I want to rebuild the Roman Empire frame of mind, and not what do we need from a economic stability standpoint. They're operating out of philosophy versus practicality.
Well, and they're more comfortable making these kind of small moves, especially like going into Yugoslavia, doing diplomatic alignment in Greece. One, because they've got the African Horn of Ethiopia as a chokehold to keep the British at least playing ball, but they also have the Spanish
and Somalia.
Yeah, Ethiopia and Somalia, and they also have the Spanish helping them with kind of military assistance, supplies back and forth.
If the Spanish get angry, they take Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Yes.
All of this becomes very important because they control a Gibraltar choke point. They can strongly influence a Malta choke point between like Sicily and
Tunisia. Yeah. So the Italians are basically kind of the guys who know they have all of the cards for the Mediterranean. So they're trying to take advantage however they can. They're kind of like to use a Game of Thrones reference, they're kind of like the Littlefinger of the Mediterranean, where they know that they don't necessarily have the power to take on the big dogs directly, but they can use it to their advantage and get whatever they think they can get out of it.
And I think this is the way that Spain operates too, because Spain, now we can finally actually mention Sanjurjo, the man who started all of this art.
This is all his fault.
Yeah, this is all his fault. And yet we found a way to not mention him at all in part 2. But, kind of a little what we discussed in the pre-planning was and I brought this up, I was like, Spain is very internally focused for most of this time. Sanjurjo is kind of busy recognizing his dream of the Carlist regime, which when we did the intro, we didn't really explain what that was. But essentially, it's not only monarchy, but basically my monarchy is better than your monarchy, and the one that has been around is wrong. And I actually want to restore the rightful monarchy to the throne. That's a very, oversimplified
It's a more
version of it.
absolutist, classic,
It's a classic
authoritarian
style.
monarchy. But there's
Yeah,
also one
exactly.
thing right around this time. So Sanjurjo dies in 36. He was basically 20 years older than Franco. So he's 64 when he dies. So this is 1944 is realistically probably
Yeah,
around when he's
I
either
think we gave him an extra 10 years at
yeah,
some point.
he's either dying or he's getting ready to step down. And the natural successor to a Sanjurjo as a sort of state leader under a king, even though it's going to be a stronger king, this is kind of much more akin to, especially if Franco kind of assumes Sanjurjo's position. This is a much more translatable kind of system to like Vittorio Emanuele and Mussolini at the beginning of the fascist rule. So this, if Sanjurjo dies right around this time or steps down, this kind of naturally brings Spain slightly less monarchical in philosophical terms, if not governance terms, and more nationalist, fascist leanings.
I think pragmatically it's more fascist.
Yeah.
I think that Sanjurjo is so, monarchical that up until the point he dies or steps down, I think it'll be very, monarchical for, all intents and purposes. But I think what you're saying, Dylan, is like once he's out of the picture and Franco, the more cold, more calculating, the more pragmatic, the less, pomp and circumstance kind of guy. He's going to step into the saddle and be like, all right, we've done our mop-up duty that we needed to do.
Franco's going to feel more able to move on the global stage.
I think he's going to be much more, because contrary to what happened in our timeline where we had Sanjurjo, dying and Franco basically, just taking a back seat, staying neutral, during World War II. He's going to be on a lesser level, but also lesser than the Italians. But I think he's going to be much more inclined to want to try and get something to make Spain great again.
Yeah.
On his terms.
But
so
he's in a really good position to do that.
And he's in a great position to do that because the British and the French, mainly the British for our purposes here of getting Gibraltar back, they have all of their fish to fry and everything that's going on in the Middle East. So the British are like, you can have it. You can take it. Who has Morocco? Who has Morocco at this point too?
What part?
Spain still has like the northern tip of Morocco and kind of the strip, but I believe the rest of it is French. It's French Maghreb, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that strengthens the Spanish position, whatever is left of the Spanish position in Morocco and Northern Africa, and then they also get Gibraltar too. So I think that would make for some very interesting dynamics down the road.
Well, and the other thing is if you have a more stabilized Spain, and I'm going to kind of switch theaters here because there's one big part of 1944 we haven't talked about yet. One, if you have a Franco with a more solidified Spain, more willing to move on the geopolitical stage. Spain once had a colonial empire that included parts of an entire continent. So he may start reaching out to America, especially South America. I don't know because we're focusing on the colonial fight, and this is more diplomatic if we want to get into it, but that may be where Franco starts moving.
Yeah, we can
save that for later.
We have a plan to address that.
I want to at least point out that may be where Franco starts also turning his head.
That he's going to start looking that direction, and that's a whole further conversation because we still haven't completely dealt with India and Bengal, the Bengal Empire, and then does French Indochina does Japan make any moves towards French Indochina?
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think at least as far as India goes, probably what ends up happening is, the Brits, at least initially, the Brits try to tamp down as best they can because they're moving they have so many logistics to get troops around. They're having to use colonial troops from South Africa and Australia to.
So
kind of-
I actually picture this. I think once they realize what's going on,
Mhm.
the BEF, British Professional Military, kind of lands. Let's call it Alexandria. They try to get there.
They head to Egypt because the lifeline to their empire is the Suez.
And I'm kind of envisioning like South Africa also supports the kind of Egyptian defense.
Yeah.
But your India and your Anzacs are fighting in the Khyber Pass.
Yeah.
That's where they go.
Yeah. And I think what the problem for India becomes the historical experience of British management of India.
Mhm.
I think what probably ends up happening is once the fighting kind of gets to the Khyber and sort of your northeastern or your northwestern Indian mountains.
Once it breaks out of those.
Yeah. I think there's going to almost be just as much, depending on how the fighting works out, if the Iranians can get significant headway into India and kind of be on the military front foot, the British and the Anzac forces are going to have almost as much trouble from the Indian populace in terms of civil unrest, wanting independence, whether that's under a sort of British recognition or just outright. They're going to have as much trouble with that as they are active combat forces from the Persians. And I think that gets to kind of a really interesting, what happens in India
once you start getting to if I got my geography correct, once we start getting to the Indus River, I believe, if I have my geography correct, but basically just think like the dividing line of Pakistan and India, we are going to have the Indians, not wanting either, the Persians or the British around. So I think a natural, kind of cutting off point, I feel, is the Persians get as far as, what we would call Pakistan today. And then with, once the Brits start coming in, the Indians can see this and take advantage of this fact. They're like, okay, enemy of my enemy is my friend. We're going to stop the Persians from advancing, but we'll also be able to extract at the end of this concessions from the Brits. At the end of this, the dividing line happens, I would say a lot sooner than it happened in our timeline between like Pakistan and India. You have the Persians take Pakistan.
The Persians grab Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Yeah,
they rebuild the Persian Empire.
Yeah,
I think they might even make it to New Delhi, which is northern India. I think they'll be able to get
Kashmir, because I think
like
Kashmir,
Lahore or something like that.
Yeah, Kashmir and like that whole northern Indian area. I don't know if they get all the way to New Delhi, but
yeah. But that's.
I think New Delhi's important because New Delhi was the site of the traditional Aryan Empire.
Yeah,
that's where that was. Like the Taj Mahal was built by a Mughal, which is part of it. So culturally, like that's important.
Yeah,
that's a keystone for them.
Yeah, so I think you can say they get that far, and then because of the economic importance of the Indian subcontinent to the British economy and the British imperial system, if they get that far, that's probably enough to at least get the British to the negotiating table as far as recognizing the demands somewhat of Persian control of Mesopotamia and this chunk of kind of northwestern India that they've got.
So you think... So here's an interesting question. One, you think this is a really interesting idea that I'm thinking about right here. Do you think we talk about T-sip and surrender monkeys? And basically Britain because of the threat to Suez and because of this is actually a really interesting idea I like. Because of the threat to Suez, the British abandoned their Middle East and abandoned like maybe the southern half of the Indian Peninsula of the subcontinent remains something for them. They come to some agreement, they take that. And they form a separate peace. They sign a separate peace with Germany and abandon the French.
With the Persians at a minimum.
Yeah, I think
whether it's with
Persians
Germany or not, but with the
the
Persians, they negotiate out with the Persians.
Well, because remember, they're in an alliance. It's not the Persians that are threatening Suez. It's the Germans and the Pan-Arabist.
Yes.
So
and
like
I think,
you need to.
Yeah, and I think what ends up happening is I think when Hitler, because you also have to remember, 44. This is a Hitler who's probably, he doesn't have some of the same stress of managing a two-front war. But this is the same Hitler who has been basically sniffing his own farts for 10 years now about how great he is. He's beaten the Soviets when his own generals still probably said it was a long shot. He thinks he's, the greatest gift to, Aryans that God has ever given. I think this is when Hitler, who's kind of starting to go fully off the deep end psychologically by this point too. I think this is when he upsets the apple cart. So I think the Persians can get their separate peace from Britain, but Hitler, at the same time as this is going on, this is when he, however he decides to do it, decides to get revenge for Versailles. Because that is always in the back of his mind.
Two thoughts of that I have. Number one, he was going off the deep end, but the cliff of the deep end happened after the coup, after the assassination attempt.
Yeah.
So
which doesn't happen at this time.
Correct.
But he's
there's a number two though.
There is a number two. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh yeah. The number two is, what does he have now that he only had in small amounts and not a lot of in our timeline?
Oil.
Radioactive material?
Radioactive is part of it. The other part of it is von Braun has gone to town. He's got a whole fleet of ME-109, of not 109s, I'm sorry. The jet
262s.
262s.
In 44?
Oh,
or
yes.
Are you saying it's 45 already?
Well, it's 44 to 45.
Call it 45 because it takes some time.
And he has oil. And I would hazard the possibility he does have lots of nice glowy stuff that he can do something with if his scientists have figured it out.
I don't think.
You don't think he has the glowy?
I think it's too early for that just because
I don't think he has the good glowy. He can't separate the good glowy from the normal glowy.
Yeah, because they didn't have the heavy water manufacturing.
I was going to say, yeah,
that is true.
I forget which choice the Germans made in their separation, but it was whichever one was the slow.
They made the bad choice.
But they made
also to quote another historical movie, they chose poorly.
Well, but here's the other thing.
Very historical.
If you look at their commitment to jet engines and their commitment to rockets and their commitment to the nuclear program, all of that almost begins in kind of 42 when they're looking at this and saying, we're not able to win with what we already have.
Yeah.
Which is not the calculus here. They may be doing experiments because they've got some Russian scientists now that they can press in.
I think they have the jets. I do think they have the jets.
I think they have the jets, but they might have some rockets.
Oh, I think von Braun wins his argument and gets what he wants.
But here's the other thing. Like, from what we're talking about here, okay, he has rockets and he has jets. What does that have to do with Britain? Because unless we actually have, we said he specifically did not do anything in Europe. If you look historically, jets are very fast, but they are not fuel efficient.
Yep.
And you can't reach Britain from his current bases. Same with the rockets. when you look at where they were launched against, they were launched
They
against
were
Britain.
mainly northern France. Yeah.
Why were they launched against Britain? Because he actually had those bases. As soon as you have kind of Market Garden and D-Day and everything, he gets driven out of range and he's attacking Antwerp. So they're not able. So I still think, especially a Chamberlain, like a Tory government, because here's the other interesting thing. I think it's a Chamberlain Tory government. If they lost India, we need to keep something. We can keep southern India.
Yeah.
And let's just come to an agreement. And you have kind of remember, there was a Popular Front government in France. There was a much more left-wing government in France.
Yep.
And
Which probably now has some remnants of whatever Soviets could escape from.
And they politically hate the Germans. And like I said, I think you have kind of this, it's a really interesting reversal here.
Does France attack Germany, Chris? Is that what you're thinking?
No, what I'm saying is this. I'm saying the French feel like they're abandoned by the British.
Okay.
Stabbed in the back 2.0.
Instead of it's exactly what happens in our timeline, only completely different.
Easy there, Yogi Berra.
Like I said, it's you hear talk about tea sipping surrender monkeys instead of cheese eating surrender monkeys. It's the French feel like the British upper crust lost their virility in the war and they weren't willing to stick it out the way we were.
Well, and this is a France that's going to be torn between, a more leftist left with
very
the
leftist
infusion of communist refugees. And in the South, there's going to be
Spanish refugees. Don't forget them.
Yes, and Spanish refugees, which gets to where I was going. Because in the South, there's probably going to be much more of a feeling of kind of bonhomie, if you will, with the Spanish and the Italians, who are much more Catholic, conservative. So basically, the poles of French politics are going to spread further to the left and right. So it's going to be a much more vitriolic French politics.
I don't want to say left and right. What I think is they go where they are, but both sides probably hate the Germans.
Yes, both sides do, but it's going to be this weird kind of balancing act that the French have to do.
So are we actually saying that there is like a British armistice?
Yeah, I can see that.
Where they keep kind of a southern India. Do we think we had hinted at this in this disorder? Is this kind of like Japan jumping in? And does Japan kind of jump in and take Indochina and Bengal area?
Yes.
Bengal?
Because they had the yes, they take Bengal because they went after it hard because the whole plan was let's go after the colonies. That's the big French colony. So let's go take them out. Is
Indochina is, but I think
China's big. I don't like.
That's
Bengal
what I'm saying.
Seems, because Indochina is much closer to the areas Japan had been kind of fighting it in China for longer, so they've got more control. I just wonder if Bengal's.
So you think
a little bit of a stretch from the Japanese natural base of operations.
Yeah. Okay. But
they have their eye on it for sure. I just don't know if they go for it right out the gate.
But maybe not Bengal. I understand what you're saying there. But you know what is a natural place for them? Singapore.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
So Malaya kind of there.
The tip of the Malay Peninsula. Yeah.
Well, the southern part of Malaysia today. Yeah. So that's what they take those two. So you have kind of some sort of actually it would probably be kind of a Nehru state.
Yeah.
A modern India, but it's Burma and kind of India minus some of it.
Yeah, it's the Deccan Plateau may be more, and Sri Lanka may be kind of a direct British dominion. The northern part of India may be something that's kind of weird, semi-independent, less controlled by the British outright.
So in our timeline, the British promised like support us and we'll give you your own country.
Yeah.
What happens in this timeline?
Well, I think
what's the settlement in India, basically?
I think the fact that the British have to settle without basically Pakistan and sort of the New Delhi region.
Mm-hmm.
There is no independent India.
I think there might be, just because the British have lost so much face. I think they may be forced.
You think they're forced to?
Either one of two things is going to happen. Either the British there's enough of a groundswell of Indian independent support from what's left of the British Dominion, where the British realize they have to give some concessions, or the British, in the immediate term, crack down super hard, which for the time we're currently in means the British control it. But do they really? And that may be, if we go that route, that may be something that gets brought up in the future whenever something reignites this powder keg that we've kind of left sitting around.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know which is more likely, but I think those are the two options.
I mean, whatever it is, it's aligned with the British.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least for now.
Is British or
I think the South much more than the Central.
Mm-hmm.
Because the further away you get from sort of the classical British trade ports that they originally acquired, where they're more entrenched.
Yeah.
I think it becomes more iffy, but yeah.
And what about the kind of traditional Middle East? I think you have some sort of pan-Arabist regime set up. I think the French were never necessarily that committed to the Levant.
Yeah.
Especially if they've now, I think the French, if they have Algeria, they're happy.
Yeah. They keep Algeria. The British mandate Palestine is gone. So that's all pan-Arab.
I wonder if they might try and, because what do the British and the French have left? I know, we've got the
Africa.
Suez. Do they have anything east
Africa,
of the
South
Suez,
India,
Sinai Peninsula?
The British probably have Aden, kind of Yemen today.
Okay.
And their kind of stop off kind of Persian Gulf allies on the way to India. I don't think much changes about that, just because I don't think the Iranians have the ability to project power across the Gulf.
So I guess where I'm going is because the war that the Persians have been in is against pretty much primarily the British, at least that we talked about.
Yeah.
So do the French kind of make accessions to the sort of pan-Arab side of things? Do they sort of combine what mandates they have in the Middle East into sort of a pan-Arab?
Well, they've lost control of them, I think. I think in the initial fighting, they
okay.
Lost
But not through direct war, just because of the nature of the pan-Arab uprising.
No, through direct war. Through I'm picturing. I got you. Rommel kind of trying to come in down to take Suez from the other end.
I got you. Okay.
So does England still have the Suez Canal at the end of this? They do. Okay.
Yeah. I think they would, because they would have just, if anything, they're going to make sure that they still have it in the peace deal. Whatever they have to give up east of that, they're going to keep the Suez.
I think maybe the Sinai is the border.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, you're saying where the border is now.
Yeah, kind of.
But the Sinai Peninsula, they just kind of draw a line there and says, because the Sinai is nothing but a big chunk of desert that nobody wants anyway. So there's nothing there. So
yeah, basically, like the British maybe go as far up the coast to like Rafah, and make like the line between Rafah and Aqaba is kind of like the focal point of where that border may or may not be, depending on who's actually got control.
I think it's, I'm trying to remember, I think it's actually the current, just because that's the border between Egypt, which was technically an independent country, and the British mandate.
Yeah.
So we'll just draw that. Let us keep that. That way everything stays good.
hmm
You know, we get the Suez. Persia, you can have northern India. So where we end is Japan has French Indochina. England basically looks at France and says, "You're on your own, buddy. We've lost too much. We're done. We're backing out of this. We've got a peace treaty. We get to keep Suez, but there's now a pan-Arab state in the Levant, kind of aligned with the Germans at this point. The new Roman Empire based out of Italy, which has Italy, Europe, Spain, and
Yugoslavia,
Ethiopia,
Metaxas, Greece,
Yugoslavia,
Ethiopia,
Metaxas,
Libya,
they're sitting
Probably
there.
we kind of
and
mentioned
other
probably,
things that we'll talk about next
Yeah.
time.
they're probably friendly with Portugal at least.
Yeah,
Yeah,
We mentioned them.
they're at least on
Mhm.
speaking terms with Portugal.
Very good speaking terms.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
Yeah.
literally where Sanjurjo's plane was taking off from.
yeah,
yeah.
So, like, the
Yeah.
Salazar regime is very much on board with everything else going on.
yeah.
So we're there, and we're in roughly 1946-ish, 45, 46.
I think
Yeah,
that makes
early,
sense.
probably spring 46,
Mhm.
something like that.
Okay, call it that.
I think we put a bow
Mhm.
on that, because now we have this uneasy, dare I say, Cold War that's going to exist between England and Germany.
Yeah, I would say tepid at the very least, if not. I don't know if cold's the right temperature.
Yeah, but there is for sure, there are tensions bubbling all over the place, but no one is actively shooting at each other on a daily basis
Yeah,
at this moment.
Well, the French are still.
The
are
French
still
are, but you
at
know,
war, but they're not aggressively pursuing it over the border.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like the phony War of 39,
Mhm.
yeah.
but kind of on the tail end, not the beginning.
Right.
Okay.
Does the BEF stay in England, or no? We pulled the BEF out earlier to
The
save
BEF
Suez.
was
It's
in
probably in
the Middle
Suez
East.
for the
Yeah,
time being.
Yeah.
For
We have
stabilization.
dropped it down to Suez to
Mhm.
stabilize it out. Okay.
So that leaves us kind of at a good stopping point, I think.
Yeah. All right. We do have some ideas for another one, so this is going to come back. Anybody else? Anybody want to kind of close
No,
up with?
I
Yep.
think that covers pretty much everything that I thought about.
Cool. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening. Want to encourage everybody to, follow us on we generally use Discord, but we try and pay attention to everywhere else to get comments. And just to close everything else out, if one should come across a fork in the road, what should you do?
Take it.
All right. See you guys next week.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.